When I think of Mars and Leo also, I always joke about this. But for those of you who've seen The Breakfast Club, I think of Emilio Estevez's character, right? And he talks about his dad like, you gotta win, Andrew. You gotta be a winner. We don't tolerate losers in this family. Which is sort of interesting because that's what Donald Trump's dad basically used to tell him. This is Saturn, girl. And Mars is now in Leo. That's right. Mars, our malevolent master of mayhem, entered the sun-ruled sign on November the 4th. That was the day before Election Day. This is going to be a long transit. Why? Because Mars goes retrograde around December 7th. This is a major part of the Mars cycle, you see. And remember, December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. Right? That's what FDR said about Pearl Harbor. Right? That was the anniversary. Anyway. Then, on January 6th of 2025, Mars will move retrograde back into Cancer. And then, he'll station direct on February the 23rd, 2025. And then we'll re-enter Leo on April 17th. And then he's going to stay in Leo until June 17th. So this is a whole 6-month ordeal of Mars nonsense. Now I'm going to do more videos about this and what this means for you in particular as we get closer to December. But right now I just wanted to do a general outline and tell you what Mars and Leo means and what Mars means for you as he transits each of the houses. So that means we're going to do very brief little horoscopes here and just talk about what Mars means for each rising sign right now, given this transit. Remember that I only do whole sign houses. And each of these will be for your rising sign because that's what determines your houses. So, what does this mean when you have the planet of conflict in the sign of self-centeredness? Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is bullies. I mean, Donald Trump has this in the first house. And my God, he's like the king of the bullies. He loves bullying vulnerable people. I mean, he was even found liable for sexual assault. It's one of the worst bullying activities. But Kamala Harris has this too, right? And the first thing that comes to mind for me with her Mars and Leo, and it's in the 3rd house, right, of communication, when she was giving a little rally or hosting a rally, and pro-Palestinian protesters showed up and, exercising their constitutional rights. And what did she do in response? She said, "I'm speaking. I'm speaking." It's such a famous line now. It even got put on t-shirts. I mean, I supported her, but it's the most Karen line ever. It's basically saying, I'm way more important than children dying in Gaza. But yeah, Mars and Leo transits bring big bully energy, but they also bring competition. Especially big sporting events often happen under Mars and Leo transits. And one fun example I found of Mars and Leo in sports was Serena Williams, the famous tennis player. She has her natal Mars in Leo, and she's won tons of victories under Mars and Leo transits. I mean, it was sort of like the time of year that they tended to be in, But it's very interesting. Now, what's even more interesting is the fact that she's won 23 Grand Slam titles, which is more than any other woman or man in the Open era. So it's an amazing indicator. When I think of Mars and Leo also, I always joke about this. But for those of you who've seen The Breakfast Club, I think of Emilio Estevez's character, right? And he talks about his dad like, you gotta win, Andrew. You gotta be a winner. We don't tolerate losers in this family. Which is sort of interesting because that's what Donald Trump's dad basically used to tell him. You gotta be a winner. And Mars in Leo is about winning, right? Essentially. Now, the other thing about all this is that Mars and Leo transits also bring heat waves. And now we're coming up on the colder months here as we approach winter. And I'm forecasting that it will probably be a warmer than usual winter, which can also bring more or intense winter storms on occasion. And less snowfall and less snowpack means drought as we head into summer of 2025. Now, for the United States, this means ideological battles. And why is that? Well, because Leo is the whole sign ninth house of the United States. And what's the ninth house? Well, beliefs, right? Ideologies and philosophy, religion, spirituality, and also foreign cultures. Now, I'm concerned about this because we're already having a clash of ideologies in the United States. And this really means a sharpening of those conflicts and perhaps open violence. Now, when this happens for individuals, it's a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I'm concerned. I'm concerned of religious clashes or people trying to impose their religious beliefs on others. And like I said, this is a 6-month ordeal. This is a long transit where we're going to see a lot of this stuff precipitate into bigger issues later. Now, I'm also worried about the foreign cultures part because of the looming possibility of getting sucked into more foreign wars. The new administration coming to power is going to oversee the conflict in Ukraine and in Gaza. And I'm a little concerned about them inflaming it and letting these things get worse. But let's talk about what this means for you very briefly. Okay? So we're going to, as I said earlier, we're going to go through Mars and what this Mars transit means for each of the rising signs. And of course, that means we're doing your horoscopes. Okay, so we're going to start with Aries rising. If you're an Aries rising, that means Leo is your whole sign 5th house. The 5th house is what? Children, pleasure, fun, performance, right? Sex. It's my favorite performance. But anyway, when Mars goes through this house, it typically means conflicts with our kids. If you have children, of course. We'll see things like our children being unruly or argumentative or just loving the word no. Now, of course, our kids should say no, to protect themselves and set boundaries. But, stuff like, honey, can you please put your dishes away? No! Excuse me. This transit with Mars in the 5th house for you too also tends to make us a bit, horny, right? It increases the libido, right? And also we get interested in sports activities. We get this, or concerts, things like that. We get this sort of mentality of like, we're going to have fun whether we like it or not, right? But whenever I have this, I typically experience it as, tension with the children and increased libido. But let's move on really quick to Taurus rising. We're just doing this very briefly. So that means Mars is moving into your 4th house, right? Which is home, parents, genealogy, origins, private life. So oftentimes it means fights with our parents, fights with grandfathers or, grandparents. It can also mean tension at home. Things can break around the home, Don't put any holes in your drywall, Be careful about that. However, it can also mean cutting oneself off from their genealogy or their past in some way. Rejecting part of your past. Letting things go. You see, Mars cuts things off, doesn't it? Mars also represents illness and injuries, so that could befall your parents as well. So just be aware of this. And make sure not to break things around your house because it'll bite you in the butt later. So Mars going through the fourth house can make us a tyrant around the home. And it can make our private life very antagonistic and ripe with conflict. It's like we don't feel comfortable alone. You might feel better at work during this time. So anyway, but let's move on to Gemini rising. So for Gemini rising, this puts Mars in your third house. Now you have to watch out for that. What's the third house? Of course, it's siblings, extended family, right? But also communication, education, and local travel, our immediate communities, all that sort of stuff. So when Mars goes through the third house, it often means fights with siblings, doesn't it? Or your extended family. And by that I mean aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. But it also indicates violent or abrasive speech, right? Conflicts with words. We tend to say really awful things around this time, so, please be careful. My girlfriend has this, so, be gentle on my poor little feelings. Now, I know when I had this, I said some really rotten stuff about a former partner, and we ended up having a breakup over it. But we have to watch out for that, for sharp tongues, saying nasty things. The other thing we have to watch out for is road rage, right? Mars in short journeys. It's like, honk, 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 blah, blah, blah. So be careful. Take your time with your trips. And please, please, please avoid the temptation to flip the bird. And I'm not talking about sparrows. I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And watch out, because these days people keep all kinds of weapons in their car, and you don't need any altercations. The other thing about Mars in the third house, besides all that, is also conflicts with neighbors. Oftentimes, conflicts in the community, you see. So just be aware of that, because people could put up a fence or an easement or I don't know. And it causes a big kind of legal to-do sometimes. So the key is to pick your battles. Watch your mouth, and watch road rage. But let's move on to Cancer rising. So this puts Mars in your second house, and the second house is our finances, our money, our possessions, our business, things like that. It's our livelihood. So when Mars goes through the second house, often we have big expenses, or we spend money too quickly. It's like it burns a hole in our pocket, Sometimes it's because we're overly optimistic about our financial situation. We think, oh yeah, I can afford this. And then later it's like, oh shoot, I shouldn't have done that, should I? Now this is very similar to the opposite house, the eighth house, which is death and debt and other people's stuff. So whereas the second house is your stuff, the eighth house is other people's. But that incorporates things like taxes, debts, but we'll get to that in just a bit. The key takeaway for this is watch your spending. It's a big deal. But it can also mean conflicts with our clients, right? With, people who are patronizing our business and things like that. So just watch out, because you don't want to say things or do things that end up hurting your business later, right? So watch your spending. And try and maintain harmonious rapport with your clients or your staff or whoever. You see? But anyway, let's move on to Leo rising. So this is your first house. And when Mars transits our first house, well, what is the first house? It's you itself. It's the whole you, mind, body, spirit, right? So Mars entering the first house often brings surgeries, or small injuries. It's quite interesting because Mars coming into the first house means that he just left the 12th, which can be a very depressing time. So when Mars enters the first house, we get this surge and rush of energy, which can also lead to what? To minor injuries like cuts, burns, scrapes, bruises, right? So that is a frequent thing. So my advice to people with Mars going through their first house is slow down, pay attention, especially when cooking in the kitchen or using sharp objects or knives or hot things. If you're working around danger like fire, sharp knives, blenders, I don't know, any of those things, be careful and pay attention, right? Because you will be inclined to rush around, and that's when we get hurt. But it does feel nice to get that Martian surge and rush in the first house. Like, right? I have the power. Anyway, let's move on to Virgo rising. So for Virgo rising, this puts Mars in your 12th house. Now, I just said this isn't a fun time. And why is it? Well, the 12th house is the house of self-undoing. It's the house of mental illness, of addiction, of mental health issues in general, isolation, being alone and secluded. And when Mars comes into the 12th house, we often get faced with self-destructive behavior. So if you've had any self-destructive patterns, they will probably come up now and force you to look at them, which isn't ever comfortable, but it's a necessity, isn't it? So self-destructive patterns. How have you thwarted yourself? How have you held yourself back? How have you sabotaged your own success, you see? That's what you're going to be confronted with. Oftentimes with Mars in the 12th house, it's about angry seclusion. We want everyone to leave us alone. Our skin is crawling. Just your presence is abrasive to me, right? If people come knocking at your door, you might even chase them off screaming, or one of those old people, spraying a hose at the kids. So just take this in stride, right? Because it's going to be a long time. And you will be addressing things that you've probably let go by the wayside, and that probably have been stoking conflicts in your life. The key word for addiction, right? Or the key phrase about when you know you have an addiction is when it interferes with your life and your relationships. But let's move on to Libra rising. So for Libra rising, this puts Mars in your 11th house. And what's the 11th house? It's hopes, friends, supporters, patrons. Yeah? It's the people who help us out. So when Mars goes into the 11th house, we often see fights with friends, right? One of my friends is a Libra rising, and I told her, I said, we're about to have some scraps, yo. Uh-huh. But it also means sometimes we get embarrassed, right? Or people reject us. Oftentimes, Mars in the 10th house brings, we'll talk about that in a second. But we get embarrassed in the 10th house, and we get rejected in the 11th, right? People cut us off, or we cut other people off. We have decisive conflicts where we're like, I'm never speaking to you again, right? It's not always a good idea. It could be hasty. We might regret it later. But Mars does cut things off, doesn't he? So you want to be careful, because that's when we lose support. And we get the opposite of support. We get people actively maligning us oftentimes. Usually because we've done something stupid. So people talking shit. I probably shouldn't have said that word. But anyway, you can expect those sorts of things. You just got to take it in stride. You got to sort of assume that your friendships are not going to be harmonious. I know when I went through this, I had a couple close friends who all of a sudden kind of ditched me. And that kind of sucked. But taught me some good lessons. So let's go to Scorpio rising. Now this puts Mars in your 10th house. And what's the 10th house? Life direction, career, what we're known for, reputation. It's our public facing, right? Whereas the 4th house, the opposite, is the private life. The 10th house is the public life. Yeah? And when Mars goes through our 10th house, it usually means fights with bosses, right? Because the 10th house is often authority figures as well. And when Mars goes through there, we tend to have little Jerry Maguire moments or freak out moments at work. Like, I'm not doing this, or I'm going home, or I quit, right? Cutting things off like jobs. Yeah, fights with bosses, I always say. But it could also be fights with coworkers, although we see them more in the 6th house, don't we? It could also be the embarrassment, as I was indicating before, with the 11th house. We can get a bad reputation as Mars transits our 10th. I know for me, when Mars transited my 10th, last time I think, was when I was getting really into doing adult content. And that did not give me the greatest reputation, although it was fine for me, you see. But just be careful. Don't do things that you wouldn't want plastered all over the news, right? Integrity. Integrity means doing the right thing, regardless of who's watching. So, maintain integrity, please. Or, that's how I used to tell my staff about integrity. But let's move on. Let's move on to Sagittarius rising. And this is just like the United States chart, and I have lots of friends who are Sag rising, and that puts Mars in the 9th house, right? And we just talked about the 9th house, representing our beliefs, spirituality, philosophy, and foreign things and foreign cultures. So when Mars tours our 9th house, we get really fanatical about what we believe. And we're inclined to get in lots of fights. We're inclined to get in arguments. And we may even cut people off over these ideological disagreements. Now, I'm going to tell you to be wise and not just cut people off over disagreements if you can avoid it. But if someone's got really terrible beliefs, then you don't need to give them any attention or fuel. For example, I'm transgender. If someone's beliefs entail me not existing, that's not a disagreement. That's a threat. So if people have repugnant beliefs, you have no responsibility or no duty to recognize them or give them any credence. But it's best to be aware of your own volatility and fanaticism and try to be mindful of it. Because we do cut people off around these things. And the other thing with Mars in the 9th house is it brings conspiracy theories and nonsense like that. Like you'll see, people going off on some, I just heard Bigfoot married the Loch Ness Monster. Sure. And they voted for Kamala Harris. Anyway, let's move on to Capricorn rising. This is Capricorn rising. Now this puts Mars in the 8th house, you see. And we talked about the 8th house a little bit earlier with the 2nd house. Rather than just being your finances, it's that of other people. And it will concern you insofar as you owe people money. Although the 8th house is also investments and returns on investment. So when we see Mars going through the 8th house, and remember the 8th house is also death and debt and taxes. So when we see Mars go through the 8th house, it often brings unforeseen expenses as well. We talked about unforeseen expenses in the 2nd house, but with the 8th house, we tend to put things on credit. You might see yourself deep in your debt situation. You might have to put additional expenses on credit or take out a loan or something like that. You could also lose money. We can lose money from gambling, poor investments, right? Or theft. Sometimes when Mars is in our 8th house, we have things stolen. Now the 8th house is also death, right? So the worst case scenario is that someone close to you passes away. But we're not going to sit there and entertain this a whole lot because it's the most extreme permutation. But just know that it's sort of a possibility, okay? So also with the 8th house, though, When Venus is in the 8th house, we often forgive people. When Mars is in the 8th house, we do the opposite. We hold grudges, right? It can bring up trauma and traumatic events, right? And criminal activity. So please keep your nose clean. Yeah. And try to avoid spending money if you can. Avoid spending too much. The interesting thing about this transit too is it's still going to be going on through tax season, right? So I think Mars re-enters Leo in April. It's right around tax time, isn't it? So, be careful about owing money, or maybe you need to file a tax extension. But anyway, let's move on to Aquarius rising. This is me, Aquarius rising. Yeah. And that puts Mars in our 7th house of relationships, right? Relationships, marriages, even past partners, adversaries and competitors, right? Oppositions. And also legal issues. And I mean, the 9th house is the law oftentimes. But it's the 7th house where we have these kind of one-on-one competitive bits, right? So I often think of breakups. Now, this is my 7th house, and I have a wonderful girlfriend, so I'm not really keen on breaking up anytime soon. But that's why we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we don't say things that we can't take back. Because words that we use now that are harmful and hurtful could erupt into breakups later, or bigger conflicts. If you're polyamorous like me, it could be conflicts with other people. Maybe other partners or other people that you've just met. It could also be conflicts with former partners, like, spouses you've divorced. So also be aware of that. There could be legal challenges, of course, with that, or court disputes between you and an ex-spouse. Could be about custody. It could be about alimony. Who knows? But that is also a possibility. I really hope that's not it. I don't like this. I don't like Mars in my 7th house. I don't like this, Sam I am. I only like green eggs and ham. But let's move on to Pisces. Pisces rising. And this puts Mars in your 6th house. Now, the 6th house is what? Originally, it was slavery, enemies, injuries, illnesses. It was not a fun house. Nowadays, we throw work in there, right? Well, that's wage slavery, isn't it? And we have our everyday routines rather than just indentured servitude. So daily life, our employees, if we're managers, right? Because, our pets, we see small animals and pets in the 6th house as well. So when I see Mars going through the 6th house, on the one hand, it's kind of a good thing because Mars rejoices in the 6th house. You see, the 6th house is all the shit we don't want to do. But Mars is the energy to do it. So you might find yourself having a good amount of energy to knock stuff off your list. The bad part is that the 6th house also has to do with our health. So when Mars goes through the 6th house, we oftentimes can get sick or experience pains and aches and have to go to the doctor to address things. Issues that we haven't dealt with just kind of mushroom, But then watch out for your pets too. Because as Mars transits our 6th house, sometimes our pets get sick or we have to take them to the vet. And we know how expensive our vet bills can get. So please, when you're busy and knocking stuff off the list, don't overdo it. Don't push yourself to the point where you have burnout, because then you'll get way less done. So remember, slow and steady wins the race, even with Mars. Make lists. Don't overdo it. But you got to take time for yourself. If you don't take time to just rest and enjoy yourself, you will get sick and you will burn out. Anyway, we're going to stop it there. And I just want you all to know I'm going to still be doing videos. I'm not going to be doing this whole kind of, scripted, edited, whatever the heck. Because My focus is kind of going more to my other content, but I'm balancing this stuff pretty well. And I'm still doing members only stuff as well. So please consider becoming a member of my channel. Anyway, I love you. You're beautiful and have a wonderful whatever it is you're having. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. And make sure to click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org. And if you can't afford a reading right now, come to my live streams and get one for free. But you have to be subscribed to get notified about them. And please consider tipping me. It helps me make such wonderful content. You can give through super thanks below or become a member of my channel. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful whatever it is you're having.